But I am a professor, sometimes known by students as a droner. And, it's not really our fault. We have to fill inordinate lengths of time, 50 minutes, 80 minutes, sometimes an hour and 50 minutes. I sort of envy preachers who can get it all done in 15 and 20 minutes. So after long and hard negotiations, we agreed that I would keep my sermon to under 40 minutes today, unless I get inspired. But luckily, it's a short psalm. It's only a 9-verse poem, and sometimes I'm reminded that it's a very short text to have spent so much time thinking about, researching, and writing a book on. I was given a fellowship for a year to work on my book back east, and I remember crossing the border into New York State after Canada, and the officer there sort of asking me, well, what I was doing. I'm writing a book on what? A Hebrew psalm, one of the biblical psalms, and he said, that's it? One psalm? And that sort of reminded me, this is a small project, but it has a very long history. It's been around for 2,500 years. It's engaged some of the greatest minds in Christianity and Judaism to kind of think about it, especially those final, difficult, violent, vengeful lines, and make sense out of them. So sometimes I like to think of this psalm, and I like to think about a congregation with one of those devices that CNN uses during election season for political debates. They'll have people talking, and they'll show those lines running under the images, and people responding. If they like a point, the red line goes up. If they don't like it, the blue line goes down. And so I think, how does a psalm like this resonate? The 9 verses of a psalm like this, how does it resonate in a church? I think the first 4 verses are by far the best known. That's what we just heard sung in Latin. Those are the verses that musicians and painters over the centuries have been drawn to because it paints a very evocative picture, right? A very vivid, evocative picture, maybe a melancholy one, right? I mean, these are exiles cast out from their homeland, moving into a future that they really have no idea what to expect. They certainly don't have any reason to expect that they're going to be well treated in Babylon. But it's a vivid scene. It's the only scene, in fact, that is tied to a particular time and place. And so, painters have had a great time representing the scene, as have musicians, because after all, those verses are about singing and whether we should sing or not. Should we respond and sing the songs of Zion, or should we hang our harps up in the trees? So it's been sort of catnip to musicians and composers, including Palestrina and many others. But as you heard last week in one of the best sermons I've heard on Psalm 137, even these first 4 verses have their challenges, because after all, in the context, these Judeans are being taunted. They're being mocked by the Babylonians. They're being told, just get over it. Sing us one of your happy songs. The Bobby McFerrin song, Don't Worry, Be Happy, right? And of course, it's not always appropriate or possible to sing a happy song. Louis Armstrong had that great song, It's a Wonderful World. And it is a wonderful world most of the time for many people. But he also sang the blues. He sang a song called What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue? So there's certain situations that call for the blues or perhaps even a primal scream. And it's possible that sitting beside the river on the way into an unknown future of captivity and slavery is one of those times. The second two verses, much less known. And the psalmist turns inward. The opening verses talk about we sat and wept, we hanged up our harps by the river of Babylon. The verses 5 and 6 turn inward. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its cunning. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So these are kind of strange lines, a little bit bizarre, maybe a little bit masochistic. Why would someone wish these particular punishments on themselves? Well, it's thought that the psalmist is channeling one of the Levites, one of the temple musicians in the Jerusalem temple that has just been destroyed, the center of all religious and ceremonial activity in Judea. And so, these are penalties that would really be awesome to a Levite who used their right hands to make music on their harps and sing and chant the praises. So this is really a curse that applies to musicians. And I'm always reminded of another line from American popular music, the Johnny Cash song. I walk the line. I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. Because you're mine, I walk the line. And I think those lines have that same sense of a sort of oath of loyalty, a sort of jealous love for Jerusalem and all that it represents, and a kind of commitment to honor that memory, to hold on to that identity, to hold on to the cultural, religious roots, to remember the covenant that seems to have been destroyed by the invasion and by what's going on among these captives that are marching their way by a very indirect route to Babylon. And these lines have been really important for political movements, political and social movements. These are lines that political leaders have fixed on as a way of reminding their followers that they need to be strong. They can't become complacent. They can't assimilate. They should not compromise. They have to retain the courage of their convictions and be willing to pay the price. And they need to remind themselves, may God stand with me. May I be punished if I lose the faith. So we come to that final verse, and when I imagine those CNN lines, I imagine the response sort of plummeting like a sack of marbles, because these are very angry, vengeful lines. These do not sound at all like religious sentiments of the sort that should be celebrated in a church, especially that final line about dashing the little ones against the stones and thinking, this is a baptism day of all days. What a text. What a text to bring into church. And so this has been a challenge for Jews and Christians now for a couple of thousand years to make sense of it. One approach is just to drop those lines, right? To just drop them from liturgy, drop them from the anthem. That's usually what happens. They're too problematic. They don't really fit. They don't really belong in a church or a synagogue anyway. No one wants to hear about, let alone celebrate, little babies getting bashed. The problem is that call for vengeance is part of the psalm, and it's part of the human condition. These emotions are all genuine and universal. In fact, probably all of us have experienced moments of rage, not too far in spirit from verse 9. Right? Think of road rage. Think of how you felt when someone cut you off in traffic, or think of those trolls down at the end of newspaper columns, and think of the kind of raw anger and hatred that pours through the internet every way. I mean, we live in a very angry time and place, and so these sentiments are with us all the time. So one approach is to just drop those lines. Another is to historicize them, say, well, you know, this psalm was written 2,500 years ago. War was very violent, very brutal. They did not follow the Geneva Conventions, right? And if you read the Hebrew Bible, you'll see there are other incidents of babies being smashed, you know, women and children being slaughtered. We know that happened all the time 2,500 years ago, and in fact has continued happening. So, yeah, that's the past. We have to understand that. Another approach that's been taken up by a lot of Christian theologians, including the church fathers, most notably St. Augustine, is to allegorize those verses, to say, really, the psalm is not about actual Babylonian babies and smashing them on stones. Really, those babies are our own sinful desires, our own lustful thoughts, right, that we all hold within us and struggle with. And as Christians, what we need to do is seize those thoughts and smash them against the rock, and the rock is Christ. Okay, so that's a sort of a clever, useful Christian allegory of how to think about violent lines of vengeance. But I want to invite us to think about these lines as an opportunity to really engage our own feelings, our own anger and rage that may occur often or maybe not as often, but is part of the world we live in, part of our own psyche. Are we really so free of those sentiments? And I think about modern warfare and how antiseptic it can seem. I mean, there is slaughter of innocents and children and non-combatants happening every day around the world, but it's the other side of the world, or it's being perpetrated by helicopter gunships or drones. It doesn't have that same sort of physical quality of hand-to-hand combat. So the notion of collateral damage, innocents being killed, is still part of modern warfare. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's part of even our own nation's experience with war. We read those stories every year or two, you know, about a misfired missile that hits a Pakistani wedding party, and dozens of people are killed. Now, I looked at what theologians say about these final verses, and maybe not surprisingly, they tell us, we shouldn't shy away from them, right? That we should avoid this kind of suburban theology that puts violence and anger at a distance, right? That's not the way it's been for most Christians over most of history. Most Christians have been sort of immersed in violent worlds. And, we think of police basically maintaining order for our society. Well, these Psalms and much of the world lives in places that do not have police, right? There's just the enemy and us, and this sort of unplacable threat of an enemy. And another theologian, Walter Brueggemann, who may be the most distinguished living writer on the Psalms, who says, okay, if you don't think this line belongs in church, or that a religious person would say it, think about someone who might say it. Think about someone in a situation where it would be very hard to resist having these thoughts. Say a Palestinian mother who has just seen her son vaporized by a bomb, for example. So that sort of brings us a little closer, helps us get beyond our sense of insulation and distance from these sort of primal forces of human emotion. Now, there's one other perspective which takes a very different tone, and this comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who lived during this whole exile period. And he was someone who was not afraid of coming down hard on the Babylonians. And as we know, he came down very hard on his fellow Judeans. He was basically making everybody angry, and he almost was killed a few times. But he spoke directly to the exiles. This was an interesting sort of schism within the Judean population. And what he told the exiles was, Build houses, exiles going off to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Now that might sound like a lot of being fruitful and multiplying, but doesn't that beat the alternative? So what happens after the exile ends? What happens after we're left with this final image of babies being dashed against the stones? Well, it's a kind of interesting story. Babylon itself is overthrown, is conquered about 50 years later. Cyrus the Great from Persia, from the east, moves in, conquers the city. Apparently, it's not a terribly bloodless, it's not a terribly bloody conquest. It's relatively peaceful. And one of the first things Cyrus does is dismiss the Judeans, say you can go back home. Go back to Judah, go back to Jerusalem, carry on as you were. And what's interesting is that probably a majority of the Judeans do not go back to Judah. They are living in Babylon. They've started new lives. They've built houses, planted gardens, started families. That's the only home they know. And hence there's been a huge population of Babylonian Jews since that period, 2,500 years ago. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions that I think the psalm is asking us to reflect on. Where is Jerusalem for you? Where is Babylon? And what are those harps that you may be tempted to hang up in the willows? Is Jerusalem People's Church, perhaps, hopefully? Is it the Peanut Barrel? Or Bigby's? Is it Spartan Stadium or the Breslin Center? Is it the shore of Lake Michigan or some cabin up north, a nice family reunion up north? All those seem like good possibilities. Where is Babylon for you? Is Babylon Ann Arbor? Is it New York City, possibly, or Los Angeles, or Moscow? Is it the Washington Beltway, right? Is it the U.S. Capitol or the White House? Is Babylon all those red states, or all those blue states, or the red counties and the blue counties around us? And so I think it's good to bring the psalm, the question home in that way. And so let me just close by asking for a moment of prayer. Lord, help us to reflect on Jerusalem and Babylon. Where are they? What are they? And who are they? And also to think about those harps in our lives, in our hearts, that we may be tempted to hang up, to put aside, as opposed to carrying into the challenges and struggles around us. Remind us to recognize and own our own anger, but also to submit it to you in the humble spirit of prayer. And when we feel like strangers in a strange land in our own country, to build houses and live in them, to plant gardens and eat their produce, and to seek the welfare of any city or country in which we may feel ourselves exiled. For in its welfare, we may find our welfare. Amen.